Open any Bible you have ever owned. Turn to Romans chapter 8, verse 32. Read it. He who did not spare his own son, but handed him over for us all. Now write down the Greek word for handed him over. It is paradidomi. Now go back to the Gospels. Find the moment Judas goes to the chief priests. Find the moment in the garden. Find the moment the arrest is made. Find the Greek word. It is paradidomi. Same word. Same exact word. God handed Jesus over. Judas handed Jesus over. In the Greek text, the actual text, they use the same verb. For 2,000 years, one of those acts has been called salvation. The other has been called the worst betrayal in human history. Same word. Two entirely different moral verdicts. And the only thing that produced the difference was which one you were taught to pray to. I was preparing for a Thursday night study group. Nothing dramatic. A few regulars who come over on Thursday evenings. Coffee, folding chairs, a whiteboard I never erase properly. We were working through 1 Corinthians chapter 11. The Last Supper passage, verse 23. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was handed over, took bread. My Greek interlinear was open on the desk. I looked down. Paradidomi. I had seen that word before. I flipped back through my notes from the previous month's work on Romans. Chapter 8, verse 32. He who did not spare his own son but handed him over for us all. Paradidomi. I sat there for a moment, then I took a piece of paper and wrote 3 questions. Question 1. What does betrayal actually require? Question 2. If Acts chapter 4 says the entire arrest was predestined by God's own plan, whose plan did Judas interrupt? Question 3. Why does Paul, who writes more about the cross than anyone in the New Testament, never once use the Greek word for betrayal when he talks about Judas? I didn't sleep much that night. Not because the questions were frightening, because they were obvious. And I had been reading this text for years without asking them. My name is Nathan, 12 years teaching history at a Catholic school in Evansville, Indiana. Resigned when I started building courses around sources the institution preferred not to name. This channel is what I do now. What I want to work through today is a specific textual problem. Not a spiritual argument, not a question of faith, a textual problem. The English word betrayed, the word attached to Judas in every Bible translation you have ever read, is a rendering of a Greek verb that does not mean betray. That is not an opinion. That is a documented finding of New Testament scholarship published by a mainstream academic press, by a scholar who spent 3 years examining every instance of this word in 1st century Greek literature. His conclusion: the translation tradition was invented inside the church. It did not exist in the language before the church created it. And once you understand what the word actually means, and what the texts actually say, the figure of Judas Iscariot looks nothing like what you were taught. Not a hero, not exonerated, something more complicated and more interesting than either verdict. Let me show you what the text actually contains. You have known the name Judas since before you knew much else about religion. You knew what it meant before you read the Gospels. You knew from context, from the way adults said it, from the way the word landed in conversation. Judas, the one who sold him out, 30 pieces of silver, the kiss in the garden, the most famous betrayal in Western history. For 2,000 years, no parent in Christendom named their son Judas. The name became the word. The word became a permanent accusation. But at some point in your life, maybe now, a question surfaced that you may not have known how to ask. If God's plan from before creation was for Jesus to die and rise, if Paul says in Romans that God himself handed Jesus over, if Luke says in Acts that every person involved in the arrest and crucifixion was doing exactly what God's hand and plan had predestined, then what plan exactly was Judas interrupting? What was he betraying if the plan required him? The church never answered that question. Because the church never officially asked it, the word betrayal was applied early. It stuck, and the logic underneath it was never examined. Let me give you the linguistics first, because everything else depends on them. The Greek word translated as betrayed throughout the Gospels, and in most English translations, is paradidomi. It appears approximately 120 times in the New Testament alone. It appears more than 200 times in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. It is a compound word, para, alongside, over, from beside, didomi, to give. The literal meaning, to give over, to hand over, to deliver. William Klassen of the Ecumenical Institute in Jerusalem spent 3 years examining every instance of paradidomi in classical Greek literature, in Josephus, in the Septuagint, and in 1st century papyri. His findings were published by Fortress Press in 1996 in a book called Judas, Betrayer or Friend of Jesus. His conclusion: no instance exists, not one, in classical Greek, in Josephus, in any 1st century Greek document outside Christian interpretation, where paradidomi carries the meaning of betrayal. The word means to hand over, to deliver, to commit to someone's custody. It is neutral, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. Its moral weight depends entirely on context. The Greek word that actually means to betray, in the sense of treachery, of violating loyalty for personal gain, is paradidomi. A different word, different prefix, different connotation. Paul never uses paradidomi about Judas. Matthew never uses it. Mark never uses it. John never uses it. The only place in the entire New Testament where Judas is explicitly called a traitor using the correct Greek word is Luke chapter 6 verse 16. A single line. A list of the apostles. Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. The Greek, prodotes. That is one use of the actual word for traitor in a list, with no narrative context. Every other accusation against Judas in the Greek text is built on paradidomi, the word that means handed over, the same word Paul uses when he says God handed Jesus over in Romans 8, the same word Jesus uses in Mark 9 verse 31 when he predicts his own arrest. The Son of Man is going to be handed over into the hands of men. Jesus used this word about himself before Judas did anything. The act was already framed as a handing over, not a betrayal, a delivery. Picture two people. Both of them hand Jesus over to be killed. The first one, God the Father. Romans chapter 8 verse 32. He who did not spare his own son but handed him over for us all. Paradidomi. This act is called salvation, the foundation of the faith, the reason for the cross. The second one, Judas, gospel after gospel, hands Jesus over. Paradidomi. This act is called betrayal, the worst crime in the history of religion. Same verb, same structure, same consequence. Jesus dies. 2,000 years of theology separated the moral verdict, not the language was the same. The moral verdict was produced by interpretation, by translators who already knew what Judas did and reached for the darkest English word available. They chose betrayed. They could have chosen handed over. They chose the word that made Judas a monster. And every Bible since Jerome's 4th century Latin Vulgate has carried that choice forward, without questioning it, without noting that God used the same verb. Now let me show you the 4 Gospels in sequence, because what they say about Judas changes with each one, and the changes are not minor variations, they are incompatible portraits. Mark is the earliest Gospel. Scholars date it to approximately 65 to 70 of the Common Era. It is the source document. Matthew and Luke both copied from it. Mark's account of Judas: he goes to the chief priests and offers to hand Jesus over. The chief priests are glad and promise money. Judas agrees. That is it. No motive, not one word about why. The chief priests offer money. Judas doesn't ask for it. They offer. He accepts. Why? Mark says nothing. The gospel that was written closest to the events assigns Judas no motive whatsoever. Matthew comes next, written approximately 80 to 85 of the Common Era, 15 to 20 years after Mark. In Matthew's version, Judas asks a question first. Chapter 26, verse 15. What will you give me if I hand him over to you? Now Judas is driven by greed. He asks for the money, and the amount, 30 pieces of silver. Matthew chapter 26, verse 15. Why 30 pieces of silver? Because Zechariah chapter 11, verses 12 and 13 references 30 pieces of silver. Matthew constructs the detail to fulfill the prophecy. Then something extraordinary happens. Matthew chapter 27, verse 9. After Judas returns the silver and it is used to buy a potter's field. Matthew writes, "Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled," and quotes a passage. The passage is from Zechariah, not Jeremiah. Scholars have noted this scribal error for centuries. It is in your Bible. It has been in your Bible for 2,000 years. The detail that has defined Judas for 2 millennia, the 30 pieces of silver, the signature of his greed, was manufactured to fulfill a prophecy, then misattributed to the wrong prophet. The construction is visible if you look. Luke comes after Matthew, written approximately 85 of the Common Era. Luke chapter 22 verse 3. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot. Now Judas is a supernatural vessel. Satan causes the act. But then Luke chapter 22 verse 22, the Son of Man will go as it has been determined. The Greek word horismenos, fixed, decreed, and Acts chapter 4 verses 27 and 28. For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. The Greek word proorison, predestined, foreordained. It is the same root Paul uses in Romans 8, verses 29 and 30, when he writes about the predestination of salvation. Luke's Gospel says the act was predestined. Luke's Gospel also says Satan entered Judas. Both things are true in Luke's account simultaneously. If God predestined the event, and Satan caused Judas to execute it, what is Judas? The instrument of a plan that required someone to do exactly what he did, a predestined vessel. The word betrayal becomes philosophically incoherent at this point. Betrayal requires a free choice to violate loyalty. Predestination removes free choice. Luke contains both concepts. Neither the church nor its theologians resolved the contradiction. They kept the word betrayal and moved on. John's Gospel comes last, written approximately 90 to 100 of the Common Era, the furthest from the events, the most theologically developed. John chapter 12 verse 6. Judas was a thief. He kept the money bag and helped himself to what was in it, a retroactive accusation that doesn't appear in Mark, Matthew, or Luke. John chapter 13 verse 2. The devil had already put it in Judas's heart to hand Jesus over. Possession comes before the Last Supper. And then, the detail that no one talks about in Sunday school, John chapter 13 verse 27. After Judas receives the bread from Jesus at the table, Satan enters him. And Jesus says, "What you are going to do quickly." Jesus commands it, not "I know what you plan," not "I grieve that you will do this." What you are going to do quickly. In John's Gospel, the most hostile portrait of Judas across all 4 Gospels, Jesus gives the command. The betrayal in John is ordered by the one being betrayed. And Paul is the earliest Christian writer we have. His authentic letters predate every single Gospel. He was writing about the cross while many people who witnessed it were still alive. Paul never names Judas, not once, not in any of his 7 authenticated letters. He writes about the crucifixion more extensively than any other New Testament author. He builds his entire theology around the cross. He references the Last Supper directly in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, no Judas. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the earliest written account of the resurrection we have, dated to approximately 54 to 55 of the Common Era, possibly 20 years after the crucifixion, Paul writes, "He appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. The 12, not the 11. Not the remaining disciples after Judas's death. The 12. By Paul's account, in the earliest resurrection document we possess, Judas is either still alive, still counted, or never existed in the story as Paul received it. The man who wrote more about the cross than anyone in the New Testament either did not know about Judas or did not consider his identity theologically significant. Think about what that means. The betrayal narrative, the greed, the 30 pieces, the kiss, the name that became a permanent curse, entered the written record after Paul finished his letters. Paul built the entire doctrinal foundation of Christianity without it. Judas was not in Paul's theology, not because Paul suppressed him, because in the tradition Paul inherited, Judas's name didn't carry the weight it would later be assigned. There is a manuscript that surfaced in Egypt, and the story of what happened to it tells you something important about how difficult this particular question has been for everyone who has touched it. In 1978, near the town of Magaga in El province, Egypt, someone broke open a limestone box in a burial cave outside the village of Beni Massa. Inside, a leather-bound codex, Sahidic Coptic, falling apart. The manuscript passed through antiquities dealers for more than 2 decades, sitting in a safety deposit box in Hicksville, New York, deteriorating. In April 2000, a dealer named Frieda Nussberger Chakos acquired it. It passed to the Messinas Foundation in Basel. Rodolphe Kasser of the University of Geneva, one of the world's leading Coptic scholars, spent years reassembling approximately 1,700 fragments. National Geographic published it in April 2006. The documentary aired worldwide. The headline, The Gospel of Judas. Judas was the greatest disciple. Jesus commanded him. The betrayal was an act of obedience. Christians wrote in by the thousands. The story ran everywhere. 6 months later, April DeConnick of Rice University read the Coptic translation carefully. She found a single word that changed the reading of the entire text: daimon. National Geographic had translated it as spirit. You will sacrifice the man that clothes me, O 13th spirit. DeConnick looked at every other occurrence of daemon in Scythian Gnostic literature, the specific theological tradition that produced this text. Every single one meant demon, not spirit, not a neutral being. The Greek word for spirit in this tradition was pneuma. Daimon meant something hostile. She then looked at the number 13. In Scythian Gnostic cosmology, the number 13 marks the realm of Aeldabaoth, the evil creator god who rules the material world. The corrected reading, O 13th demon, not the 13th enlightened disciple, the 13th demon. Simon Gathercole of Cambridge University translated the text independently for Oxford University Press in 2007. He reached the same conclusion. Judas in the Gospel of Judas is not a hero. He is associated with the demonic realm. He is called a demon by Jesus. DeConnick called National Geographic's process scholarly malpractice. The research team had been bound by non-disclosure agreements that prevented outside peer review before publication. The correction received a fraction of the coverage the original announcement had, and here is the note at the end of this story that nobody adds in the follow-up reporting. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 of the Common Era, mentions the Gospel of Judas in his work against heresies. He calls it heretical. The text existed and was being condemned 1800 years before National Geographic published it. So there is no version of the Gospel of Judas that rehabilitates Judas in the clean way the documentary suggested. The most optimistic reading, the National Geographic reading, which turned out to be mistranslated, merely shifted Judas from villain to obedient instrument. The accurate reading makes him a demonic figure, and even in the mistranslated version, Jesus orders the act. The handing over is commanded. Either way, the word betrayal doesn't hold. J.J. Benítez spent 40 years reconstructing the events of the last days of Jesus from every source available to him, canonical and non-canonical. Historical, archaeological, literary, and in Caballo de Troia he returns repeatedly to a moment at the Last Supper that John records in chapter 13, and that no homily I ever sat through addressed directly. Jesus, knowing everything that is about to happen, knowing who is in the room, knowing the hour, handing Judas the bread himself, looking at him, and saying, "What you are going to do quickly." Benítez's reading of that moment is not exoneration. It is something more precise. Jesus came in Benítez's account to demonstrate that death is a threshold, not an ending. The crucifixion was not incidental to the mission. It was the mission's mechanism. The mechanism required someone to set it in motion, one specific person, on one specific night, at one specific hour. And when that person was in the room, Jesus handed him the bread and released him. The man who executed the mechanism was turned into a monster for 2,000 years. Not because the texts call him one in a unified voice, they don't. Mark gives him no motive. Paul doesn't name him. Luke says it was predestined. John says Jesus commanded it. The monster was constructed, layer by layer, each gospel adding a darker color, the church inheriting the darkest reading and carrying it forward. There is something that happens when you hold all of this at once, not a theological conclusion, more like a disorientation. You were taught that Judas was evil because he freely chose greed over loyalty. That is the Sunday school version. That is the version that has shaped Western moral vocabulary for 2,000 years. But then you look at the text. Mark, no motive. He accepts money that is offered. Why he goes, the earliest gospel never explains. Matthew, driven by greed, asks for money, 30 pieces, a detail added to fulfill a Zechariah prophecy, then misattributed to Jeremiah. Luke, Satan enters him, but the act is predestined by God. The free will required for betrayal is explicitly removed by the text. John, the devil already has him. Jesus commands the act. The latest gospel has the most demonic Judas and the most explicit divine control simultaneously. Paul doesn't name him, uses paradidomi, never uses paradidomi, writes about the cross more than anyone else, and never builds a theology around Judas's crime. Acts, predestined, God's hand, God's plan. If you add all of these together without collapsing them into a single narrative, what you have is not the portrait of a freely choosing traitor. You have a figure whose motive shifts from nothing to greed to supernatural possession across documents written over 30 years. You have a figure about whom Paul, the church's greatest theologian of the cross, is entirely silent. You have a figure about whom the earliest gospel says nothing motivationally, and the latest gospel says Jesus ordered the act. You have a figure whose moral guilt requires free choice, but whose act the same canonical text calls predestined. The word betrayal cannot absorb all of that without breaking. The word the text actually uses, paradidomi, handles all of it perfectly, because paradidomi doesn't assign guilt. It describes an act, a handing over. Whether that handing over was treacherous or instrumental or predestined or commanded, the Greek word holds all of those possibilities open. The translators closed them. They chose the word that made the story simpler. They chose the word that gave the institution a villain. And the word they chose was not in the original text. There is something I want to say carefully, because this investigation has a temptation embedded in it. The temptation is to arrive at an easy reversal. Judas was actually good, actually. Judas was the greatest disciple. Judas was framed. None of that is what the evidence shows. What the evidence shows is more unsettling than a reversal. The evidence shows that the narrative of Judas's betrayal was constructed from a Greek word that doesn't mean betrayal, applied to an act that multiple sources in the same canon describe as predestined, ordered, or satanically compelled. The four Gospels give four incompatible explanations. The earliest written source doesn't name him. The text the church cited as rehabilitation turned out to be a hostile Gnostic text, incorrectly translated by a team under non-disclosure agreements that prevented correction. What you have is not a clean answer. You have a 2,000-year tradition built on a translation decision, and the decision was made by interpreters who already knew what Judas did and chose the English word that matched what they knew. The circularity was never examined. The Greek was never questioned. The institution needed the villain, so the villain stayed. You'll hear the name Judas again, maybe in a sermon, maybe at Easter, in the reading of the Passion. Maybe someone will use it as an insult. Don't be a Judas, the way people use it without thinking about the weight the word carries. And now you'll know something you didn't know this morning. The English word betrayed was a translation choice, not a translation fact. The Greek word is paradidomi, to hand over, to deliver. God used it in Romans chapter 8 when he handed Jesus over for the sake of all of us. Jesus used it in Mark chapter 9 when he predicted his own arrest. Paul used it in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 when he described himself handing on the tradition of the Last Supper. And Judas used it, or it was applied to Judas, in the same night it was applied to God. Same word, same night, two verdicts, 2,000 years apart. The verdict against Judas was set by people who chose a word the language didn't authorize. The plan was predestined, according to Luke and Acts. The act was commanded, according to John. The name doesn't appear, according to Paul. The motive was never given, according to Mark. And in the gospel that attempted his rehabilitation, the translation was wrong. That is the textual record. Not a verdict, not an exoneration, not a comfortable resolution, just the words, in the language they were written in. Before someone chose how to translate them, you decide what to do with this.